in Professor Campbell's book, which was recently translated into Russian, and in general, the book Knowledge and the Ends of Empire was a very important event for Central Asian studies, for Russian studies. It raised a lot of very important questions and make a very important impact, right, in the field. So, Professor Campbell, you will have some 50 minutes for your talk, and then we will open the Q&A session. Today we have in our audience we have a lot of students majoring in history, but also those who are taking History of Kazakhstan course that we teach every semester for new students as a compulsory course. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from students and faculty members. So please, Professor Campbell.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Repilov. I want to begin this presentation with some expressions of gratitude, particularly to Nikolai Tsyrempilov for inviting me, and to all of you, more than 150 now, it looks like, for your attendance. I've been a long-time admirer of the work that's being done at Nazarbayev University, and it's an honor to share some time with you now. I only really wish I could be there with you in person, but I will be coming to Kazakhstan later this summer to do some research, and I hope that our paths might cross then.
Wow, it's good news.
And it is 7 in the morning here, so forgive me my coffee while I speak. So my talk today is a short sketch of the main arguments of my first book, Knowledge and the Ends of Empire, published a few years ago by Cornell University Press. It's now available in Russian translation as well from Academic Studies Press. Since it's just a short sketch of the book, I'll be omitting some details from the talk, and I would be happy to speak more about any such details afterwards if you have questions, or also to answer questions that any of you who've read the book have that weren't addressed in the talk. Okay, so let's begin, if not from the very end of my story, then from almost at the end of the story. It was the summer of 1915, and Alikhan Bukhayanov, statistician, forester, and Kazakh autonomist politician, wrote furiously on the pages of the journal Kazakh. To be fair, Bukhayanov was often furious on the pages of Kazakh. This time, his ire was directed against the activities of a seemingly quite modest person. This was a statistician of the Imperial Resettlement Administration named Vasily Kuznetsov. Several years before Bukhayanov had written his article, Kuznetsov had sharply reduced the norms of land use for the Kazakhs of Semipalatinsk Oblast. These norms established the minimum quantity of land that was to remain in use by nomadic Kazakhs of the steppe oblasts in accordance with the Steppe Statute of 1891. Lands above this quantity were considered to be surpluses, which could be seized from the nomads' use for various state priorities. Most often in the steppe oblasts, this was for the allotment of land to settlers from the European parts of the empire. Bukhayanov criticized Kuznetsov for a whole series of errors, comparing his work unfavorably with the work of other statisticians who had studied Kazakh land use prior to Kuznetsov. He paid particular attention to the work of Fyodor Andreevich Shcherbina, in whose expedition Bukhayanov had himself participated in the 1890s. In the end, Bukhayanov wrote, in Kuznetsov's work, there were so many errors that his land norms were not the statistical truth, but a simple lie. Such land norms, he wrote, this is one of my favorite phrases that I ever came across in my research, caused the Kazakhs' heritage to be castrated. or the Kazakh originalist Kazakhanenyenchisin Kaitapishtude. I believe that Bukhanov's rage in this article had its reasons not only in the resettlement policy of the Russian Empire, which by this time had harmed a great many Kazakhs. Of course, resettlement policy was a highly disputed question and a source of great dissatisfaction for the Kazakh autonomous movement, the Kazakh intelligentsia. I think, though, that the epoch of resettlement was the end of another epoch in which Russian-speaking Kazakhs, having received their education most often in Tsarist institutions, discussed and influenced imperial policy on the steppe. This epoch lasted for several decades. In these discussions, Kazakhs were intermediaries between the Kazakh population and imperial administrators, being at times members of both of these groups. In conversation with administrators, in works written in the Russian language, and for an imperial audience, they positioned themselves as the bearers of valuable knowledge about Kazakh lands and the population of the steppes. Knowledge which, in fact, they had, and which administrators frequently lacked and were aware that they lacked. Such relations between national intermediaries and imperial power, and the corresponding role of Russophone Kazakhs, could only have existed in a period when the imperial administration was aware that there were limits to what it could know, that there were therefore limits to the policies they could undertake and carry out, and when they had therefore a more fluid approach to governance on the steppe. I do not wish to describe Tsarist administrators, who of course had their own prejudices and flaws, as any kind of heroes of tolerance or proponents of the friendship of peoples or whatever. Still less do I want to insist that they were always and everywhere eager to accept the knowledge and practices of local non-Russian actors. This willingness, or lack thereof, depended on political conditions and on the character and experiences of any individual bureaucrat. No, I simply want instead to emphasize the important changes that imperial resettlement policy brought with it to the steppe. This was a change not only in policy, but in epistemology, the way that the steppe was known. Both the methods of producing knowledge about the Kazakh steppe and the people who produced this knowledge, and the opinion of imperial administrators about the completeness or lack thereof of their knowledge about the steppe, all of these changed starting in the 1890s. The statisticians and leading figures of the resettlement administration created a new picture of the life and economy of the steppe, based on figures that appeared precise. This super quantitative approach gave the appearance of absolute certainty to their discussions about the presence and the future of the steppe. This seeming certainty, in turn, permitted statisticians, as well as politicians who advocated for resettlement, figures like Pyotr Stolypin and Alexander Krivoshein, to insist on the correctness of their arguments and the erroneousness of others, strengthening their own authority in doing so. This approach to knowledge and the possibilities that knowledge created was extremely confident, even swaggering. They believed that on the basis of such precise knowledge, it was possible to increase to an extreme the use of all productive forces of the empire, to resettle great numbers of Slavic Orthodox peasants from what they called the crowded lands of the European parts of the empire to the lands of the Kazakh steppe, which seemed to them little productive or even empty, and in the end, to modernize or even save the empire itself. Such an approach to knowledge and information brooked no criticism. Local knowledge, obtained in a different way and expressed in a different way, most often qualitatively and subjectively, not quantitatively and apparently objectively, could not find application in this new knowledge system. Intermediaries from among the Kazakhs, like the aforementioned Bukhanov, who tried to participate in discussions about the life of the steppe as they had prior to the 1890s, especially prior to 1906, understood that they could not do this anymore. The approach of the imperial government and its main representatives in the steppe changed. Kazakh intermediaries and imperial power parted ways. In making this argument, I am arguing against various theses which I consider overly broad about the role and place of national intermediaries in European colonial empires. And I'll say parenthetically, just by the way, just to get this out of the way, I do consider the Russian Empire in the steppe oblasts and in Turkestan to be very much a part of the family of European colonial empires. Of course, with some local particularities, but every colonial empire has some particularities. So in what I'm arguing against, I have in view, for example, the work of Partha Chatterjee on South Asia and David Scott on the Caribbean. Both of these historians, when they write about intermediaries, ascribe enormous power to the ideas and institutions of the imperial center. Therefore, they argued that local intermediaries, subjects of the empire, had almost no freedom of action or independence of thought. Such intermediaries were instead, as Scott puts it, conscripts of modernity, their freedom of thought and action ever more restricted by the inexorable structural changes that colonialism brought. As I studied the activity of Kazakh intermediaries, I came to the conviction that such arguments contradict historical reality. They oversimplify the question. One must, just the opposite, seriously study the ideas and activity of local intermediaries in a concrete historical context. We have to restore these figures their historicity. It seems to me that working in this way, we will better understand the contingencies, the various possible paths of development of imperial policy on the steppe. There was nothing inevitable in the way that Kazakh intermediaries and their imperial interlocutors parted ways at the start of the 20th century. Just the opposite, this break was the consequence of concrete actions and concrete decisions which could have been different and which might have led to different results. In my view, this epoch of cooperation and conversation between Kazakh intermediaries and Tsarist administrators concerning questions of useful information about the steppe took a step forward, entered a new era during the 1840s and the 1850s, which is where my narrative in the book starts. I consider the activity of such a famous figure as Chokhan Chingizovich Valikhanov to be an excellent example of this sort of cooperation. The apogee of it came later, after the promulgation of the Provisional Statute in the Steppe Oblasts in 1868. The Kazakh intermediaries whom I am discussing were, in the words of a historian of Brazil named Alida Metcalf, they were representative intermediaries. They produced knowledge about the steppe and its population, both for themselves and for an imperial audience. And in this, they became, for the state, representatives of life on the steppe. The Provisional Statute was a key moment for the arguments that I am advancing in this talk in three senses. First, the Provisional Statute extended direct Russian rule to all oblasts of the steppe. Several of these areas had previously been ruled instead through Kazakh administrators. Thus, the Provisional Statute changed the intermediary roles that were accessible to Kazakhs and even, in a certain sense, restricted the nature of these intermediary roles. Second, the Provisional Statute was a consequence of the lengthy efforts of the so-called Steppe Commission, led by Fyodor Karlovich Girs, to study the steppe region and in so doing obtain information useful for governing it. To say this another way, the provisional statute was the consequence of reformers' consciousness that they knew little about Kazakhs and about the steppe region. Members of the Steppe Commission tried very hard to make up for this deficiency. They broadly read the published works about the steppes. They worked in local archives in Omsk and Orenburg. And they did today what we would call field research. They conversed with local people. They experienced local conditions. The Steppe Commission was, in the end, an expensive and time-consuming bet on the positivist idea that more and better knowledge will naturally lead to better administration. And thirdly, and this is really the most important thing, by the end of the Steppe Commission's work, its members were clearly aware that they did not have enough information to make any kind of final and definitive conclusions. The statute that they promulgated was introduced as an experiment, which was to last only for 2 years. After this experimental term, the provisional statute was to be rewritten on the basis of practical experience. But as it turned out, both because of bureaucratic happenstance and because of simple convenience, inertia, even you could call it, the experimental term lasted not 2 years, but 25. The New Steppe Statute, as many of you know, was written in 1891, but introduced only in 1893. And so for 25 years, the steppe region was governed by an experimental statute, and the statute was experimental precisely because it was thought there was not yet sufficient knowledge to write a permanent one. This made administration of the steppes quite liquid, to the extent that in practice it was often subordinated to the wishes and to the caprices of various middling and lower level administrators. Thus, the military orientalist and bureaucrat Alexander Konstantinovich Gaines described the conditions of governance during his brief service in Turgai Oblast. Administrative practice and the execution of policy, or not executing it, depended more on the personal view of mid-level bureaucrats, uyezdniye nachalniki, than on a well-defined and agreed-upon plan. A whole generation of Russophone Kazakhs, the majority of whom received at least part of their education in imperial schools, made use of this indefinite environment to polemicize about the future of the steppe, both among themselves and with Tsarist administrators. Sometimes, under favorable political and administrative circumstances, from such discussions emerged genuine influence on imperial policy. The pedagogue and ethnographer Ibrahim Altansarin, in my view, is a classic example of this phenomenon. And it's for this reason that Altansarin gets a whole chapter in the book. Altansarin had a long correspondence with such leading Orientalists as Nikolai Ivanovich Ilminsky and Vasily Vasilyevich Grigoriev. By the end of his short life, Altansarin had risen to the rank of inspector of Kazakh schools of Turgai Oblast. In this position, he was able to put into action several ideas that he had expressed in different works about the future of Kazakhs within the Russian Empire, changing the society in such a way that it corresponded to these ideas. Altansarin tried to emphasize the linguistic and cultural differences between Kazakhs and Tatars, and spoke against Tatar influence, which he, together with the majority of Tsarist officials in the steppe region, considered harmful. He insisted on the importance of Islam in Kazakh culture, society, and identity. He saw the economic future of the steppe not in agriculture, but in more effective, intensive, and modernized stock raising. He believed that this was more suitable both from the point of view of the environmental conditions of the steppe and the habits and customs of the Kazakhs themselves. And thanks to a favorable coincidence of administrative circumstances, he was able to change the Kazakh schools of Turgay Oblast precisely in this direction. One can further note, within this framework, the polemic between the participants and correspondents of the official Dalawalyatanin Gazeti Kyrgyzskaya Stepna Gazeta in the 1880s and 1890s. They too, among other things, discussed the economic future of the steppe. Some insisted on the necessity of a transition to agriculture and a sedentary way of life. Others saw in sedentarism, or at least in a reduction of nomadism, certain advantages, but still considered agriculture unsuitable for steppe conditions. They wanted instead, as I say in the book, to perfect pastoralism. A third group saw certain advantages precisely in nomadic stock raising, although they acknowledged that it was necessary to improve it. By the mid-1890s, ideas opposed to agriculture and sedentarism began to find a much colder reception among imperial bureaucrats than 10 years before that. It was at this point that imperial authorities began to consider precisely sedentarism and agriculture as key factors in the future of the steppe. Such a change of view among Tsarist administrators heralded the start of the parting of ways of Kazakh intermediaries and imperial authorities. Previously, imperial administrators had had often quite different views of sedentarism and agriculture for the Kazakhs in particular. Even until the 1850s in particular, governors in the steppe oblasts opposed Kazakh sedentarism not in practical terms, but in principle. For one, Vasily Alexeyevich Perovsky, the military governor of Orenburg province, was so opposed to sedentarism that he reprimanded subordinates who permitted Kazakhs to settle on the land. After Perovsky's time, after the 1850s, Tsarist administrators were able to agree that Kazakhs should, at some uncertain time in the future, and in some unspecified way, become sedentary. It is clear, for example, that members of the Steppe Commission were guided by this idea when developing the provisional statute. However, there was no agreement about when precisely the Kazakhs ought to settle on the land, by what means, or what their economy should be like after they did so. Administrators sometimes discussed Russian peasants as likely bearers of civilization and sedentary culture. But, first of all, there was not agreement even on this. And second, peasants resettled to the steppe during these first years, during these decades of the provisional statute, only in very limited and restricted numbers. And even this called forth the protests of some lower-level Russian administrators. Such an ambiguous relationship of Tsarist administrators towards resettlement began to change in the 1890s, after experiments the previous decade with new laws on peasant resettlement. Drought and famine in the European parts of the empire in 1891 and 92 compelled thousands of Slavic peasants to abandon their homes and desperately resettle to the steppe, hoping in this to save their families and households. These were the so-called samovoltsi, not a new phenomenon in the life of the steppe, nor indeed in the life of Siberia, but now arriving in unprecedentedly large numbers. Simultaneously with this, and unrelatedly to the agrarian crisis of European Russia, the provisional statute was finally updated in 1891. The new steppe statute, among other things, clarified one unclear point in the provisional statute. According to the provisional statute, steppe pastures were in Kazakhs' use on rights of long-term rental. The steppe statute clarified, especially in Articles 119 and 120, that since the nomadic Kazakhs were renting state lands, their pastures were subject to seizure for state needs. At the moment of the famine, at the moment of the introduction of the steppe statute, it was not yet clear that the question of resettling the peasantry would become as important for the Tsarist state as it did after 1900. But the issue became, with time, genuinely very important. New state institutions like the Committee of the Siberian Railroad and the Resettlement Administration appeared to help the settler wave and to bring it into some sort of order. The very existence of these institutions supported and encouraged further resettlement and created places in the government, institutional homes for proponents of resettlement policy. It is very likely, in my view, that these institutions would not have emerged without corresponding changes in the views of state actors about the possibilities that the steppe presented for the economic modernization of the empire, and without growing agreement at higher levels about the ability of Slavic peasants to quote-unquote civilize nomads who were considered backwards. And I'll just say parenthetically, such new views, I think, were important for granting legal sanction to permit the peasants to abandon their old places and to actually give them new places on state lands, to support this rather than making them go back. Without these reasons motivating them, there only would have remained one reason to allot steppe lands to the peasantry, which is to say, well, you know, the peasants really want to do it, and this has never in the history of the Russian Empire been a sufficient reason to do anything, that the peasants really want something. Now, in the early years of resettlement to the steppe oblasts, statistical research of the steppe was done to allot land both to settlers who had come earlier and to new settlers whom the Siberian Railroad brought to the region in ever greater quantities. From 1896 through 1903, the Expedition for Research of the Steppe Oblasts, led by the famed Zemstva statistician Fyodor Andreevich Sherbina, undertook detailed economic research of Kazakh households in various, what Sherbina called natural historical regions of the steppe. Although the ecological part of the research was not Sherbina's strong suit, he was really an economist and a statistician, Sherbina and his assistants, one of whum was Bukhanov, strove at least to compare similar natural historical regions. When grouping and comparing these, they were, as possible, to consider factors like the fertility of the soil, the quality of the pasture, the quantity of accessible forest, and potable drinking water, to determine if the land being used was actually good. The final goal of this research was to define precisely the quantity of land in desyatinas which a typical Kazakh household used. This figure, multiplied by the number of Kazakh households in a given uyezd, would define the precise quantity of land necessary for all Kazakhs of the uyezd. Then it was necessary simply to subtract this figure from the total quantity of land in the uyezd to receive the quantity of so-called izlishki, or surpluses. These surpluses, according to the steppe statute, were subject to seizure for state needs. And more, during this expedition, state needs were understood primarily as resettlement and the allotment of land to peasant settlers. In practice, Sherbina's research left Kazakh nomads more land than the scanty minimum necessary for existence. Such a result emerged for several reasons, but I would like to highlight two. First, in the 1890s, still many administrators in the steppe oblasts, both uyezdnachalniks and governors, still related at best indifferently to peasant resettlement, or at times with active hostility. Local administrators' opinion of the new settlers was not nearly as high as the opinion that prevailed in St. Petersburg. These local administrators were seriously concerned about having responsibility for the welfare and good behavior of thousands of new peasants not yet accustomed to life in new conditions. Second, what Sherbina and his assistants saw in the steppe did not indicate to them the broad practicability of sedentary agriculture there. The materials that the expedition published in more than a dozen volumes, although their goal was allotting land to Russian settlers, could not conceal several inconvenient truths. Most importantly, that an enormous quantity of steppe land was suitable only for pastoral nomadism. Therefore, it was necessary to leave the Cossacks more land, a quantity sufficient to support pastoral nomadism, which was, on the majority of steppe lands, the only occupation by which people could exist, or even extract some of the means for existence. Bukhanov, alongside other members of the Cossack intelligentsia, insisted on the norms developed by Sherbina as an example of the way resettlement bureaucrats harmed Cossack welfare and rights after 1905. In this era, resettlement, as Treadgold put it decades ago, at flood tide. Resettlement played an important role in the projects of Sergei Yulovich Witte and then of Stolypin to achieve the economic modernization of the Russian Empire, bringing to a maximum the use of the so-called productive forces of the empire, its land, and its people. Mass resettlement of peasants to the steppe oblasts demanded the growth of the supply of available surplus lands, and thus required the reduction of norms of Cossack land use, so that there would be more surpluses which could be and allotted to new settler villages. And as new research was done to produce such norms, new facts replaced those in Sherbina's materials in accordance with new state needs. Among the sources of these new facts was the work of Kuznetsov, to which Bukhanov had so strongly objected. Kuznetsov went out to Akmolinsk Oblast to study the same lads that Sherbina had studied a decade prior. And having gone there, Kuznetsov claimed to have seen simply fabulous changes in Kazakh land use under the influence of resettlement. And I use the word fabulous here in a literal sense, as in it came from fables. The changes that Kuznetsov observed often did not actually exist. But the changes that Kuznetsov felt he had seen meant that now a typical Kazakh household required less land for its existence than Sherbina had thought a decade ago. And accordingly, it was possible on the basis of these new statistical facts to reduce the land norms. In the files of the Resettlement Administration, and on the pages of its semi-official journal, Vaprosy Kolonizatsiy, there appeared an apparently objective and constantly growing collection of such facts, which it seemed could not be opposed. On the basis of this data, it seemed that Cossacks were quickly transitioning to sedentary agriculture. It seemed that Cossacks had settled on land that was completely suitable for their new occupations. It seemed that under the influence of resettlement and settlers, they had grown not poor, but rich. And I'll just say again parenthetically that there was a kind of alchemy required both in numbers and in rhetoric to get these kinds of results. And I can talk about this in detail in the Q&A if it is interesting to anybody but me. But the most important thing, and I want you to see this in some of the images I've got here, the most important thing about these new facts was the apparent kind of objective facticity of the data. It was organized in neat tables and diagrams that stretched for hundreds of pages. It was gathered and derived, it seemed, according to the best modern statistical methods. Work like this was an inseparable part of what Peter Hultquist has called the technocratic ethos of the resettlement administration. Bureaucrats of this administration thought that they had all the necessary information about the world. Such a relationship to knowledge and the surrounding world brought with it the support of influential people in the Tsarist government. And with this support, they boldly decided the questions that interested them, like the future of resettlement, the future of the steppe. The complete certainty of bureaucrats of the resettlement administration and their supporters that they themselves knew precisely and objectively the present and future of the steppe did not leave for Kazakh experts and intermediaries, nor more modest Kazakhs who were affected by resettlement policy, an effective rhetorical approach to discussions of their future. The arguments that they had been able to use in attempts to influence Tsarist policy were ineffective in this new environment. If Kazakhs pointed to the poverty caused by the actions of the resettlement administration, resettlement bureaucrats could cite data indicating that Kazakhs were growing richer, not poorer. When Bukhanov cited land norms developed by Sherbina and argued that such norms were the best approach to resettlement, as well as a guarantee of Kazakh rights to land, resettlement bureaucrats countered with arguments that they considered weightier. They pointed to technical errors in Sherbina's work, which they claimed deprived it of accuracy, and which they claimed did not exist in work done after Sherbina. Journals in the Kazakh language, most notably Kazakh and Aikap, polemicized about the economic future of the steppe, but without an influence outside of the steppe. The future of the steppe had already been defined from above and according to government data, and the future of the steppe was therefore progressing toward the future inexorably. Only the revolt of 1916 in Central Asia revealed what the data of the resettlement administration, without considering other sources of information about the steppe, concealed. That resettlement created serious problems for the Kazakh population of the steppe, from which many could not see an escape. Now, what conclusions should we draw from this story? We don't see here, I think, intermediaries constrained and degraded by the coming of some kind of uniform and inevitable modernity. Instead, we see them caught by surprise by a sudden change of policy, which did not find unanimous support even at the very height of its popularity, and which had found very little support only a few years prior. So I don't think these are captives of modernity exactly. To analyze Kazakh intermediaries as captives of modernity, we would have to accept the arguments of a Stolypin or a Krivoshein that resettlement of the peasants was the only means to improve the economic productivity of the steppe and thus to modernize it. I think that this would be a very hard argument to defend. And yet Petersburg advanced precisely this argument and believed that acting this way, all the facts were on its side. In taking this decision, the ministers and bureaucrats of the Russian Empire chose modernization by a path that Kazakh intermediaries could not support. And so this story is really the Kazakh variant of a story that happened in many parts of the empire at different times of the 1800s. Educated people who had previously sought cooperation with the Tsarist government were abandoned by that government and forced, very much against their own instincts and wishes, to find a different path. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for a fascinating talk. And you finished a bit, even a bit early, right? So it means that we have more time for
I thought
questions.
I would rather take too little time than too much.
Okay, great. So it's time for questions and comments, whatever. I would like to announce to the audience that we have 2 ways to ask questions. You can raise your hand and we can and then use your microphone, or the other way is